11. Type 100, Japan. Japan entered World War II with a military philosophy rooted in the Meiji era: precision, discipline, the bolt-action rifle as the backbone of the infantry. Submachine guns, in the Imperial Japanese Army's view, were somewhat beneath them, an inelegant solution for an army that prided itself on marksmanship. That attitude shows in the Type 100. Introduced in 1942, the Type 100 was chambered for the 8mm Nambu cartridge, a round that, even by the standards of the day, was considered underwhelming. Not particularly fast, not particularly hard-hitting. It was fine for a pistol. For a submachine gun expected to dominate a jungle firefight, it left a lot to be desired. But the round wasn't even the main problem. The main problem was production. Early models were manufactured with a level of craftsmanship that would have been admirable on a hunting rifle: carefully machined components, polished metal, detailed finishing work. That sounds good until you realize that while Japan was lavishing attention on individual Type 100s, the Soviets were stamping out PPSH-41s by the hundreds of thousands. Japan produced roughly 10,000 Type 100s by 1944. Then the situation became desperate, and a simplified version arrived: rougher, cruder, a mass production attempt that came far too late to matter. The paratrooper variant had a folding stock that was genuinely clever, but cleverness on a drawing board doesn't win battles. Soldiers who used it reported a weapon that worked. It fired, it cycled, it didn't regularly jam, but that offered nothing exceptional. In a theater where American Marines were closing in with Thompsons and grease guns, the Type 100 was Japan's acknowledgement that they'd come late to a conversation that everyone else had been having for 20 years.
10. United Defense M42, USA. If you've never heard of the United Defense M42, you're not alone. It's the ghost of American submachine gun history, present, technically competent, and almost entirely overlooked. Designed by Carl Swebulus, the M42 was chambered in 9mm parabellum rather than the .45 ACP that Americans were more familiar with. The idea was that a 9mm weapon would be easier to supply in European theaters, where German and Allied ammunition was everywhere. Sensible logic. The execution was decent. It was reliable, reasonably accurate, and had a twin magazine feed system that was genuinely innovative. You'd load 2 magazines side by side, and when one ran dry, you simply slid the other into position. Fast reloads in theory. In practice, the M42 got a quiet thumbs down from the US military, who were already committed to the Thompson and later the M3. It wasn't rejected because it was terrible, it was rejected because it wasn't meaningfully better than what already existed, and the logistics of introducing another weapon, another manual, another set of spare parts into an already complex supply chain simply wasn't worth it. The OSS, America's Wartime Intelligence and Special Operations Agency, procured a number of them for clandestine operations, primarily because the 9mm round was easier to hide in occupied Europe. So the M42 found its niche in the shadows, used by agents and resistance fighters who needed something that wouldn't immediately announce American. It's a weapon that did its job quietly and was quietly forgotten. There's almost something poetic about that for a weapon that spent its life in the OSS, but competent and forgettable still lands it at number 10.
9. Erma EMP, Germany. To understand the Erma EMP, you need to understand that Germany was actually ahead of almost everyone in submachine gun development. The MP-18, designed by Hugo Schmeisser in the closing months of World War I, had already demonstrated that a compact automatic weapon could be devastatingly effective in trench warfare. Germany came into the 1930s with more institutional knowledge about SMGs than virtually any other nation. The EMP, Erma Maschinen Pistole, was the product of that lineage. Designed in the early 1930s, it was a professional, well-built weapon. Chambered in 9mm parabellum, it had a wooden stock that gave it rifle-like handling, a solid feel in the hands, and it worked reliably in reasonable conditions. The problem is the phrase, reasonable conditions. And when North African sand got into those tight tolerances, or when Russian mud found its way into those precision-fitted parts, the EMP had a habit of making its operators very unhappy at the worst possible moments. It also came with a side-feeding magazine design that, while functional, made certain shooting positions awkward. And by 1940, Germany already had something better waiting in the wings. The EMP served adequately in the early war, particularly in Spain during the Civil War, where it gained some combat experience. But it was a weapon whose era passed quickly, replaced by a design that understood the brutal realities of modern industrial warfare in a way the EMP simply did not.
8. M1928A1 Thompson, USA. Now we're into complicated territory, because the Thompson is famous. It is perhaps the most culturally iconic submachine gun ever made, associated with Chicago gangsters, Irish rebels, Humphrey Bogart films, and the American GI fighting his way through Europe. There's a reason it has that reputation. At its best, the Thompson was a formidable weapon. The 1928A1 was heavy, brutally, punishingly heavy. A loaded Thompson with a drum magazine weighed over 10 kilograms. For comparison, a fully loaded M1 Garand, a rifle, weighed around 4.5. Carrying a Thompson through the jungles of Guadalcanal or up the mountains of Italy was a test of physical endurance as much as combat readiness. Then there was the drum magazine. The 50-round drum was so loud when it rattled that soldiers on night operations were known to remove them and switch to the quieter 20-round box magazine. A magazine that compromises your tactical silence is a significant design failure. It fired the .45 ACP round, which was powerful and effective at close range, but lost velocity quickly, limiting its useful engagement distance compared to 9mm chambered competitors. The Thompson was later simplified into the M1 and M1A1 variants, which addressed many of these issues. Those were genuinely better weapons. The soldiers who carried it often loved it for its stopping power. The logisticians who had to supply it were less enthusiastic.
7. Austen, Australia. Australia in 1942 faced a genuine crisis. Japanese forces were advancing through the Pacific. The fall of Singapore had been catastrophic. Supply lines from Britain were stretched to breaking point. Australia needed to arm its soldiers, and it needed to do so largely on its own. The solution was to look at what the British were already making, the Sten, and the Germans were already making, the MP40, and build something in between. The result was the Austen, and the result was mixed. The Austen took the MP40's folding metal stock and telescoping recoil mechanism, combined it with the Sten's receiver and trigger group, and added Australian manufacturing. The folding stock was a genuine improvement over the Sten's fixed wire stock. It made the weapon more compact, more useful in tight spaces like the jungle terrain Australian soldiers were increasingly fighting in. The problem was complexity. The MP40's internals, while excellent in a German factory with German engineering tolerances, were harder to reproduce with the tooling available in wartime Australia. The Austen ended up costing significantly more to produce than the Sten, and its reliability, while acceptable, wasn't dramatically better. Australian soldiers, bluntly, didn't love it. The Owen gun was being developed at almost exactly the same time, and when that weapon entered service, the comparison was unflattering to the Austen. The Owen was simpler, tougher, and better in the mud. The Austen wasn't a bad weapon. In a world without the Owen gun, it might have been remembered more kindly. But history judges weapons against their contemporaries, and its contemporary was, as we'll discuss later, one of the best submachine guns of the entire war.
6. Sten MK2, United Kingdom. The Sten is one of the most remarkable weapons in military history, not because it was the best, but because of what it represents. By 1940, Britain had its back against the wall. Dunkirk had cost the army enormous quantities of equipment. The threat of German invasion was real. Churchill's government needed infantry weapons, and it needed them by the hundreds of thousands immediately, without straining a manufacturing base that was already building Spitfires and Hurricanes. The Sten MK2 was the answer, a weapon so simple it could be manufactured by small workshops with basic equipment. The entire receiver was essentially a steel tube. The barrel could be removed and replaced in seconds. The horizontal side-feeding magazine was a direct copy of the German MP28, which meant captured German ammunition could be used in a pinch. Estimated cost, around 10 shillings per unit, around $2 in American money of the time. It was ugly. Soldiers called it the plumber's nightmare and the stench gun. The magazine feed was notorious for causing jams if the weapon was held by the magazine housing, which was the natural thing to do and which every soldier instinctively tried. The safety mechanism was rudimentary, and there were documented cases of the weapon firing when dropped. And yet, the Sten became one of the defining weapons of the resistance movements across occupied Europe. It could be disassembled into parts small enough to hide in a coat. It could be manufactured in a basement workshop and smuggled through checkpoints. It put automatic firepower in the hands of ordinary people fighting for their lives against occupation. That earns it genuine respect, even at number 6.
5. M3A1 Grease Gun, USA. If the Thompson was the movie star of American small arms, glamorous, heavy, beloved, the M3 was the workman who actually got things done. America, by 1942, had recognized that the Thompson was too expensive and too complex for mass production. The solution was a design study with a ruthless brief. Make something that fires 45 ACP reliably, costs as little as possible to produce, and can be manufactured using stamped sheet metal rather than machined components. The result was the M3. Its nickname, the grease gun, came from its visual resemblance to the automotive tool, and it wasn't meant as a compliment. But that slow rate of fire turned out to be a genuine advantage. It was controllable. Single shots were achievable with trigger discipline. Ammunition was conserved. And in close quarters fighting, room clearing, vehicle combat, the cramped interiors of armored personnel carriers, manageable accuracy mattered far more than cyclic rate.
The M3A1, introduced in 1944, simplified the design even further by removing the manual cocking handle and allowing the operator to cock the weapon by inserting a finger directly into a recess in the bolt. Fewer parts, easier to manufacture, easier to maintain in the field. Armored crews loved it. Tankers who needed something compact and reliable when they had to exit a burning vehicle found the M3A1 ideal. It wasn't a weapon that anyone wrote poetry about. It was a weapon that worked, that you could fix with minimal tools, and that kept working when you got it wet, dirty, or knocked around inside a Sherman tank. By the war's end, over 600,000 had been produced. It served in American military inventories for decades after. That kind of longevity doesn't come from looking pretty. 4. Beretta Model 1938, Italy. Italy's military performance in World War II is a subject that history has, frankly, been somewhat unfair to, and the same unfairness has extended to Italian weapons. The Beretta Model 1938 is consistently under-discussed in English-language histories of the war, and that's a genuine oversight, because this weapon was, by almost every technical measure, exceptional. Designed by Tullio Modengoni, the Model 1938 was built to a standard that would have been considered luxury engineering by the Army's frantically stamping out mass-produced weapons elsewhere. It had twin triggers, a semi-automatic trigger and a fully automatic trigger, giving the shooter immediate, intuitive choice of fire mode without any selector switch. This sounds like a small thing. In a firefight, it wasn't. The 9mm parabellum round as chambered in the Model 1938 was loaded to higher pressure than the standard German specification, giving Italian-manufactured ammunition slightly better performance from this weapon. The bolt was machined from solid steel, the wooden stock was furniture grade, the barrel had a compensator to genuinely reduced muzzle rise. The downside was the same as many quality items. It was expensive and slow to produce. As the war turned against the Axis, Italian manufacturing capacity struggled to maintain production numbers. The Model 1928A and subsequent variants introduced simplifications, but even simplified, the Beretta remained more labor-intensive than British or American alternatives. For a soldier lucky enough to carry one, it was a genuine pleasure, smooth, accurate, well-balanced, and reliable. Italy may have had a complicated war, but the Beretta Model 1938 was a weapon that any army in the world should have been proud to field.
3. MP40, Germany. The MP40 is probably the most visually recognizable submachine gun in history. If you've watched any film set in World War II, you've seen it. The folding metal stock, the distinctive pistol grip, the forward-angled magazine. It became the cinematic shorthand for German soldier in the same way the Thompson became shorthand for American GI. Unlike some weapons that gain reputation beyond their actual performance, the MP40 genuinely deserved its status. Designed by Heinrich Vollmer and manufactured by Erma, correcting from the EMP's shortcomings notably. The MP40 was a weapon built around stamped and pressed components rather than machined parts. This was revolutionary thinking for Germany in 1940. The Wehrmacht understood that the coming war would be fought on an industrial scale, and weapons that required skilled machinists to produce would become bottlenecks at the worst possible moments. The result was a weapon that balanced quality and producibility in a way few designs achieved. The folding stock made it compact enough for paratroopers, vehicle crews, and NCOs who needed to move through tight spaces. The 9mm parabellum round was effective and widely available. The rate of fire, around 500 rounds per minute, was controllable. German soldiers on the Eastern Front, fighting in temperatures that froze lubricant solid, found the MP40 more dependable than almost anything else they carried. Its one notable weakness was the single-stack 32-round magazine, which some soldiers found insufficient for sustained automatic fire. A twin magazine adapter was developed, but it added weight and complexity. The PPSH-41 71-round drum magazine would have seemed like science fiction to an MP40 user. But for a weapon that had to be produced by the hundreds of thousands, fielded in every climate from Norwegian fjords to Libyan deserts, and maintained by men who weren't gunsmiths, the MP40 was a near-perfect solution to an almost impossibly difficult engineering problem.
2. PPSH-41, USSR. If you want to understand why the Soviet Union won the Eastern Front, a significant part of the answer is a weapon designed by Georgy Shpagin in 1941 and put into production so rapidly that it seems almost impossible. Shpagin delivered something extraordinary. The PPSH-41 was designed from the start to be manufactured using basic industrial equipment, the kind found in a tractor factory or an automotive plant, which was relevant because Soviet tractor and automotive factories were converted to produce it. The receiver was made from stamped sheet metal, the wooden stock was simple, the total number of parts was minimal. Production figures are almost incomprehensible. Approximately 6 million PPSH-41s were built during the war. 6 million. At its peak, Soviet factories were producing around 3,000 per day. The weapon fired the 7.62 by 25mm Tokarev cartridge, a high-velocity round that moved significantly faster than the 9mm Parabellum or .45 ACP used by Western designs. This gave it a flatter trajectory and better penetration at range. The 71-round drum magazine meant that Soviet soldiers could sustain fire long after their opponents needed to reload. The cyclic rate was staggering, approaching 900 rounds per minute in some configurations. In close combat, a Soviet assault wave with PPSH-41s was genuinely terrifying. German veterans of the Eastern Front consistently described the experience of facing massed PPS fire as unlike anything they had prepared for. The weapon had real weaknesses. The drum magazine, for all its capacity, was notoriously finicky. Drums from one weapon sometimes didn't fit another, requiring individual matching. The weapon was somewhat heavy and, at high cyclic rates, consumed ammunition at a rate that stressed supply chains. A simpler version, the PPS-43, was developed and was arguably better in several ways.
1. Owen gun, Australia. And here we arrive at something that rarely gets its due in the popular history of World War II weaponry. Not German engineering precision, not Soviet industrial scale, not American manufacturing genius. The finest submachine gun of the Second World War was designed by a 24-year-old Australian named Evelyn Owen, built in the coastal city of Wollongong, and carried through some of the most brutal jungle fighting of the entire war. What made the Owen gun special? Start with the magazine. The barrel was quick detachable. You could pull the barrel out and replace it in seconds in the field. The separate pistol grip and trigger housing could be removed for cleaning without any tools. The ejection port had a cover. The design was, almost paradoxically given its origins, among the most maintenance-friendly of any weapon of the war. Soldiers in the Pacific who carried it called it a mud plugger. That wasn't an insult. That was a badge of honor. They meant that you could shove this weapon into the mud of a New Guinea riverbank, pull it out, and it would still fire. The Sten would have choked. The Thompson would have needed cleaning. The Owen kept going. Post-war tests carried out by the Australian Army are revealing. Its closest competitor in the test results was its own later replacement, the F1. The MP40 was precise German engineering. The PPSH-41 was the Soviet Union's industrial might made physical. But the Owen gun was something different. A weapon so fundamentally well thought out that it worked when nothing else would, in the conditions that no weapons designer back in a European factory had properly imagined. The soldiers who carried it in Papua New Guinea, Bougainville, and the islands of the Pacific didn't need a ranking list to tell them what they already knew. When the bullets started flying and the rain started falling and the mud swallowed everything, the Owen gun was the weapon you wanted in your hands.
Now we've reached machine guns, ranked from worst to best. Rank 12, Breda Modello 30, Italy. Let's start at the bottom, and I mean rock bottom. Picture this. It's 1941, North Africa. The desert sun is baking the ground at 50 degrees. You're an Italian soldier, dug in, the British are advancing, and your machine gun decides, now is a good time to jam. Meet the Breda Modello 30. On paper, a reasonable light machine gun. In reality, one of the most infuriating weapons ever handed to a fighting man. Here's what made it genuinely miserable. The Breda didn't feed from a detachable box magazine like a sensible weapon. It fed from a fixed, hinged magazine, 20 rounds, that you had to manually load with a stripper clip while the weapon was hot, in the desert, with sand in everything. But wait, it gets worse. The designers, in their infinite wisdom, decided the cartridge needed to be oiled before it entered the chamber. Yes, the gun came with its own oiling mechanism, because an already slow reload process clearly needed more steps. Oiled cartridges in desert sand. You can probably imagine what happened next. Sand stuck to every round. Rounds jammed. Men died. The Breda 30 is proof that elegant engineering on a drawing board means absolutely nothing on a battlefield.
Rank 11, Type 11 Light Machine Gun, Japan. Moving from Italy to Japan, and the Japanese Type 11 has a story that, honestly, deserves some sympathy. Because the thinking behind it wasn't stupid. The execution just collapsed under reality. The Type 11, introduced in 1922, was designed with a clever idea. Used the same ammunition as the standard infantry rifle. No special belts, no separate logistics chain. Just grab rifle rounds from any soldier next to you and keep firing. Smart, right? The problem was the hopper feed system. Picture a funnel sitting on the side of the gun where you literally dump in loose cartridge clips. Sounds convenient. But this hopper was open to the world, to rain, to mud, to the jungle humidity of the Pacific. Japanese soldiers fighting in China, the Philippines, and the Pacific Islands found that their Type 11 was reliable under one condition: perfect conditions. And war famously offers 0 perfect conditions. The low cyclic rate, about 500 rounds per minute, wasn't terrible, But between the feeding problems and the complex mechanism that required careful, gentle handling, this was a weapon that asked too much of soldiers who were already exhausted and operating in some of the harshest environments on Earth. Japan eventually replaced it, which tells you everything you need to know.
Rank 10. Chatellerault M1924/29, France. France entered World War II with the Chatellerault, a light machine gun that was genuinely decent in the 1930s. 25-round magazine, top-mounted, firing 7.5mm rounds at about 500 RPM. Ergonomically strange, but functional. The problem wasn't really the gun. It was the context. By 1940, the Wehrmacht was moving faster than anyone had anticipated. French doctrine relied on methodical, fortified defense. The Chatellerault was a weapon designed for a war France expected to fight, not the blitzkrieg that actually arrived. In 6 weeks, France fell. The Chatellerault ended up in German warehouses, used by occupation forces, handed to collaborator militias. It's a weapon that became famous mostly for falling in the wrong hands. Competent, outclassed by events. Tragic, in a way.
Rank 9. Bren gun, Britain. Now, here's where this ranking is going to make some people furious. And good. You should be a little angry. It means you care. The Bren is beloved. It is iconic. Ask any British veteran of World War II about the Bren, and their eyes light up. Reliable, accurate, simple to maintain, the Bren was genuinely a fine weapon. So why isn't it higher? Because the Bren had one fundamental limitation that crippled it as a machine gun, a 30-round curved magazine feeding from the top. Sounds fine. But a true machine gun needs sustained fire, suppression, keeping enemy heads down for extended periods. And 30 rounds, gone in about 3 seconds of full auto, meant your gunner was reloading constantly. The Germans, as we'll get to shortly, solved this with belt feed. The Bren did not. The result was a weapon that excelled as an automatic rifle in the hands of a trained crew, but could never truly dominate the sustained fire role the way its German counterparts could. The British knew this, by the way. They tried to compensate with sheer numbers of Brens per section. That helped, but it doesn't change the fundamental math. Legendary reputation, real limitation.
Rank 8. Degtyaryov DP-28, Soviet Union. If the Bren is the beloved British gentleman, the DP-28 is the hard-working Soviet workhorse who never complains and never quits. Introduced in 1928, the DP-28 fed from a distinctive flat, pan-shaped drum magazine that sat on top of the receiver, 47 rounds. Soldiers called it the record player because of how it looked. That magazine gave it a real advantage over the Bren, more rounds before reloading. The DP-28 fired about 550 rounds per minute, was simple enough that a moderately trained soldier could strip and reassemble it under stress, and it worked in the Russian winter, which, if you know anything about World War II, was a condition that broke most weapons. It had weaknesses. The bipod was attached at the muzzle, which affected accuracy during sustained fire. The recoil spring sat under the barrel and could weaken from heat. And the pan magazine, while offering more capacity than the Bren, was slower to change than a box magazine. But ask a Soviet infantryman at Stalingrad what he thought of his DP-28, and the answer was probably unprintable in the best possible way. Rank 7. M1919 Browning, United States. John Moses Browning designed more weapons that shaped modern warfare than almost any other human being in history. The M1919 is one of his more underappreciated masterpieces, overshadowed by its own family members. The M1919A4 was the medium machine gun that American forces used everywhere, mounted on jeeps, on tanks, on fixed emplacements, in aircraft. Belt-fed, 30 caliber, reliable, and putting out 400 to 600 rounds per minute. It was heavy. At about 31 pounds without the tripod, the M1919 was not something you moved quickly, and that weight defined its role. This was a set-piece weapon. You picked your ground, you emplaced it, and then you dominated that ground. American GIs from Normandy to the Pacific knew the M1919 as something between a comfort and a burden. Comforting when it was yours, a terrifying problem when it was pointed at you. Dependable, not glamorous. Exactly what it needed to be.
Rank 6. The Vickers, Britain. Speaking of dependable, the Vickers. A weapon so reliable that British forces used it from World War I all the way through to the 1960s. That's not a typo. The Vickers was a heavy, water-cooled machine gun that could maintain sustained fire for extraordinary periods without overheating, because the water jacket around the barrel essentially solved the heat problem that plagued every air-cooled weapon. At Gallipoli in World War I, a Vickers team reportedly fired 1 million rounds over 12 hours. 1 million rounds. The gun kept going. In World War II, the Vickers was aging. It was heavy, complex, required a full crew, and lacked the tactical mobility that modern war demanded. But as a defensive weapon, on fixed positions, on ships, on fortified lines, nothing matched its endurance. Old, heavy, almost indestructible.
Rank 5, DSHK, Soviet Union. We need to talk about the heavy side of this ranking, and the Soviet DSHK is where things get serious. The DSHK, affectionately called the Dushka by Soviet troops, meaning sweetie, was a 12.7mm heavy machine gun that entered service in 1938. This was not a weapon for suppression. This was a weapon for destruction. Anti-aircraft, anti-vehicle, anti-emplacement, anti-anything that moved, the DSHK's heavy rounds punched through cover that infantry machine guns couldn't touch. Mounted on T-34 tanks, on naval vessels, on armored cars, it gave Soviet forces a heavy fire option that the Germans genuinely respected. The DSHK wasn't subtle. It was the Soviet answer to a simple question: what if we made the machine gun angrier? The answer worked.
Rank 4, Browning M2HB, United States. And here is the gun that answers the same question, but arguably does it better. M2, Modus. Half an inch of bullet, up to 850 rounds per minute. A weapon so effective that it has been in continuous service since 1933, and the United States military still uses it today. In World War II, the M2 was everywhere American power projected itself. On Sherman tanks, on PT boats, on B-17 bombers in quad mounts that turned the sky into a wall of lead. On landing craft at Normandy, German soldiers developed a specific fear of American vehicles precisely because of the M2 mounted on them. The range, the penetration, the sheer authority of that half-inch round. It made Allied vehicle crews feel powerful in a way that smaller caliber weapons simply couldn't. Browning designed this weapon in the 1930s. Engineers have been trying to replace it for decades. They keep failing, because you cannot improve on something that is already exactly right.
S tier, best tier, the machine guns that defined World War II. Rank 3, MG34, Germany. Now we enter German territory, and this is where World War II machine gun history gets genuinely revolutionary. The MG34, introduced in 1934, was the weapon that invented a concept: the general-purpose machine gun. Before the MG34, armies had light machine guns for infantry and heavy machine guns for fixed positions. The Germans said, what if one weapon did both? The MG34 was belt-fed, air-cooled, and could be fired from a bipod as a light machine gun or mounted on a tripod as a sustained fire weapon. The barrel was designed to be changed rapidly. A trained crew could swap a hot barrel in seconds, solving the overheating problem that plagued other designs. Rate of fire, 800 to 900 rounds per minute. At that speed, the MG34 didn't sound like a machine gun. It sounded like a zipper. Allied soldiers called German machine guns Hitler's buzzsaw, and the MG34 is where that nickname was born. Every NATO country that adopted the GPMG concept after World War II, including the weapon that replaced the Bren, including the American M60, was following the blueprint that Germany wrote with the MG34. There was one problem. The MG34 was expensive, complex to manufacture. Tight tolerances meant it struggled in extreme cold and mud, and as the war escalated, Germany needed something they could build faster.
Rank 2, ZBVZ26/VZ30, Czechoslovakia. This one deserves a moment of recognition that it rarely gets. The Czechoslovak ZBVZ26 and its slightly improved sibling, the VZ30, was one of the most influential machine guns ever made. It directly inspired the Bren. It was exported across the world. And when Germany occupied Czechoslovakia in 1939, the Wehrmacht used captured ZBs throughout the war. What made the ZB remarkable was its engineering philosophy, simplicity and reliability above all else. The tilting bolt system was robust. The gun functioned in conditions that jammed its competitors. And the quick change barrel, genuinely quick, faster than most contemporaries, gave it sustained fire capability that light machine guns rarely had. The tragedy of the ZB is that Czechoslovakia was overrun before its full potential was ever realized. Its children, the Bren, the ZB-53 medium machine gun, went on to serve in armies around the world. The original, in some ways, was the best.
Rank 1, MG42, Germany, the greatest. There is no debate. There has never been a debate. The MG42 is the greatest machine gun of World War II and one of the greatest firearms ever manufactured. Let me tell you the moment it announced itself. They were not prepared for the MG42. The MG42 fired at 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute. The individual shots blurred into a single continuous mechanical scream. American medics began seeing a new kind of psychological trauma, men who weren't wounded but couldn't stop shaking after hearing it. the U.S. Army actually issued a training pamphlet. It said roughly, "The MG42 sounds more frightening than it is. Do not panic when you hear it." The fact that they had to publish this pamphlet tells you everything. But the MG42 wasn't just psychological warfare. The engineering behind it was a masterpiece of wartime innovation. The MG42 used stamped metal components, not machined parts. Manufacturing time dropped dramatically, costs dropped dramatically, and yet the weapon that came off the line was more reliable, more robust, and more devastating than what it replaced.
The barrel change system, the feature that made sustained fire possible, was redesigned to be even faster than the MG34. A trained crew could swap a barrel in under 10 seconds. The gun never had to stop for long. The belt feed system was smooth and reliable in mud, in snow, in desert heat. The bipod was sturdy. The tripod mount, the Lafette 42, turned the weapon into a precision sustained fire system capable of indirect fire at ranges exceeding a kilometer. It didn't just win its category, it invented the category that every machine gun since has been measured against. The greatest machine gun of World War II. And it isn't close.
If you liked this video, I'm sure you'll like this one too. Subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Our channel is small, so we are replying every comment below. Comment any suggestion for future videos. Thanks for watching.